Why are Indian people always on the phone? My wife is from India and always on the phone. She calls me all the time rather than text. The only thing I got from her when I asked is that's just how they grew up. Person shrugging. Just seems like cultural differences. She's always on the phone with family and friends. I have no idea how she has the energy. She is on the phone with her sisters, mom, grandma, friends so much. I'm glad they enjoy it. I'm pretty much the opposite though. I never call anyone. If you are ever in an Uber and your driver is Indian and on the phone, see if you can get a peek at the length of time the call has been going on. I've seen 4-hour phone calls. I read an interview once with a taxi driver about this. He said they were all helping to keep each other awake. If I had to take a guess, it's probably because they're on the phone with family and friends that live in other countries. So if, say, they're in the USA, they'll probably want to talk to their relatives in India, then call a friend that's in Britain, then call another person in Canada, and so on. When my brother was in the military overseas, he was constantly on the phone or on FaceTime whenever he was available. This is so funny. BC, the Indian doctor at the place I work, is constantly chatting away on her headset skull. I mean, whatever, she's a doctor, but it did make me laugh to notice this after this post. I usually assume people are talking long distance to family. I have another coworker who is from Jamaica and she does the same thing. She's talking to her family back home. I work with an Indian man. He receives up to 67 calls a day from his friends. I don't care, he gets all his work done and is good at his job. He also talks about the catch-up with family friends every weekend, and they have catch-ups with like 34 other families each day of the weekend. I think it's 'cause us Indians are very social creatures and oftentimes just talk to someone to keep away the boredom. You know, catching up on the latest goss from back home, of which there's always a lot, or sometimes just feel like speaking to someone in your tongue. It's pretty common in India as well for cab drivers and autowallas to be always on the phone. As someone who worked with and served them regularly, they're just really community and family oriented. When I'd sell them electronics, they'd bring their mates, and it was like a group decision to help the one person. Or they'd call home to see if they were getting a good deal off me. Haha. Super interesting. Even my friends who are more westernized than others are still a lot like this. I'm not Indian, but I assume it's because if they don't check in with every single family member at least once a day, they're considered rude, antisocial, full of themselves. This is just based on the couple of Indian families I knew growing up and the couple I know now. Though, you have to make the effort, especially with older relatives. And also then everyone is always calling their friends. And then potentially calling people on behalf of people. It's considered friendly and normal to chat a lot and support each other and whatnot. Whereas in Anglo-based cultures, that much socializing is seen as invasive, especially in middle class and above circles. Most of the ones I've met are talking to family abroad while their family has time. I've always happily let my Indian Uber drivers continue their call. The Indians I know are used to being around people constantly with little privacy, and when they're alone they get really anxious. It's like social anxiety, but afraid of being away from people instead or around them. I live in a community with a lot of units where 45 people from India live. Ottawa, Canada. Mostly are around 20-30 years old. Always on their phones like that. Morning, noon, night, outside, walking around, on the bus, parked in the hallways. If we don't grind, we don't eat. It's their mothers. Indian guy the first work with has a girl on the side and the only time they get to talk at length is while he is at work. I noticed this too, but I was too afraid to ask. And I genuinely want to know why. I live in Japan and I often see Indians, Nepalese, and Sri Lankan talk on the phone all the time. I'm not generalizing because I actually had lived with people of these three countries. Sometimes even when they're on bicycle. Also, to follow up on this question, why often on speaker? I can understand when you're on your own. But in public? Most of them are working 12-16 hours a day for 7 days. The only way to connect with family and friends is on the job. I also noticed it too. Imagine moving to a country where you don't know anyone. It's just a form of getting social interaction for the day. Probably 'cause they own the place and can get away with it. Whereas most cashiers at corporate locations can't. Texting in another language can be a pain. And talking is just straight up better emo.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.